All right, everyone, we'll get started now. Hello, everybody, and thank you for attending our second Climate Change and Your Health webinar on disease presented by Credit Valley Conservation. This is the second webinar in our series of 3 webinars on the issue of climate change and health. Originally, this was supposed to be an in-person workshop, but although we cannot meet you in person, we are happy to be able to provide you this information virtually. So my name is Josh Brooks, and I am the program assistant with our rural residential outreach team at Credit Valley Conservation, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. So as we move forward, I'll be introducing you to a panel of experts as we explore the issue of climate change, disease, and its impact on health. I want to draw your attention again to the attendance form that we have posted in the question box area. Without this, we do not have your email address, so we cannot provide you with any follow-up after the webinar. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so as we go, feel free to post them in the Q&A box. We may not be able to get to everyone's question, but we will follow up with you afterwards. So before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about Credit Valley Conservation. Since 1954, Credit Valley Conservation has been responsible for protecting, managing, and restoring the natural resources of the Credit River watershed, which is located within the Golden Horseshoe, one of Ontario's most populated areas, or one of Canada's most populated areas. You may have visited one of our conservation areas, attended an event, or even taken part in one of our tree planting opportunities. We also monitor flood hazards, conducting permit and regulations, and we also lead research and innovation to keep our environment healthy and climate change resilient. This work is made possible by the support of our partner municipalities who provide funding and the delivery of these programs and services. I would also like to take time to acknowledge the land and water and the first people of this land. We acknowledge that the land on which we live and work and that of the entire Credit River watershed is a part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The Credit River watershed and the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. As citizens, we continue to be part of these treaties made with Indigenous peoples, and we recognize their enduring presence on the land. We also affirm that this land and water is our common source of life and that we must share in its care and prosperity. So we hope that this webinar will help you care for your land and water and prepare you for the challenges of the upcoming climate change that we face. So before I go ahead with anything, I'd like to just introduce our panel of experts for today. So we have Tim Kuntz, our water resource hydrology and hydraulic specialist. We also have Kelsey McNeil, a watershed monitoring specialist. And we have Helen Doyle, Environmental Health Workgroup Chair with the Ontario Public Health Association. Now also in the background, we have Alison Quinu, who is the Senior Coordinator for Rural Residential Outreach, and she'll be helping field your questions and answer them at the end of this presentation. So disease isn't exactly an issue that's at the forefront of our mind when we think of climate change. It's not something that's tangible that you can grab onto or see. Disease, like climate change, is also a broad issue that overlaps and has many connections. However, today we'd like to focus on vector-borne disease. So in other words, disease that's spread by organisms, and in particular ones whose spread is being facilitated by climate change. We will dive into some of the trends and impacts associated with climate change and disease in the Credit River watershed, and we'll also be taking a look at the trends across the GTA and how they will impact human health and some of the actions that you can take to protect your family, property, and your community. So when you registered, we conducted a survey that consisted of 3 questions. So let's take a minute now to look at the results of the first question. Do you think disease will increase with climate change? So it seems like everyone feels like disease will be increasing as climate change comes. But before we even get to that question, maybe let's take a step back and ask, is there even a connection between climate and disease? Well, the simple answer is yes. Since ancient times, we've known there's a relationship between climate and disease. We have historical records and habits from the ancient Romans. It's because Rome was surrounded by wetlands. The ancient Romans used to build the grand villas high in the hills and would spend the dog-hot days of summer there to avoid mosquitoes and the risk of malaria that they brought with them. Pretty smart idea. Climate variables do have an influence on disease-carrying vectors and their spread. And 2 of the major climatic forces driving this influence are temperature and precipitation. So to better help explain this connection, I'd like to introduce our first expert now, Tim Kuntz. Tim works with our real-time monitoring group and is involved in collecting climate data that we use to monitor the climate in the Credit River watershed. So maybe he can tell us a little more about the climate trends that we're going to see in the watershed.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Josh. Good morning, everyone. Before we get to some of the trends that we've seen in our watershed, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to our current climate monitoring network. So as part of CVC's flood forecasting and warning program, we're continuously monitoring river and weather conditions throughout the entire watershed. So we're constantly looking at things like river levels, stream flow, and a variety of climate parameters, including air temperature and precipitation. Now, all of this data is available in real time to the public, and it can be accessed at the link at the bottom of the screen here. So most of those stations that I mentioned in the previous slide are relatively new. They've been installed within the past decade or so. However, to accurately detect long-term climate trends, what we really need is a long-term data record so we can sort through any noise or year-to-year variability that we know we see in climate. Now, we've obtained this data from 2 Environment and Climate Change Canada stations located in or near our watershed. The first one is located in Mississauga at Pearson Airport, and the data record there goes back to the 1930s. The second station is located in the northern part of our watershed in the town of Orangeville, and the data record there starts in the 1950s. So these 2 stations give us the long-term record we need to perform a strong analysis. So that trend analysis was done as part of the Integrated Watershed Monitoring Program. A statistical program was used to look for 2 specific components. First, was there an overall trend? Did things change from the start of the monitoring period until the end? And second, if we did see changes, what months or seasons showed the greatest magnitude of change? So when we look at our air temperature trends, overall there was a very clear warming pattern. So our average temperature has increased all 12 months of the year. The most significant increase is seen in winter, and we're going to look at that in a little more detail on the next slide. Now, our average minimum and maximum temperatures have also increased. Interestingly, we've seen our minimum temperatures actually increase faster than our maximum temperatures. So essentially, our nights are warming quicker than our days. Now, considering the temperature increase, it's not surprising that the length of our growing season has also been increasing. So the growing season is is defined as the date from the last frost in spring until the first frost in fall. Now, since the 1930s, we've seen an increase in this in about 40 days. And as you're going to hear later in the webinar, this is significantly tied to environmental pests and pathogens. So given our warming winters, it's no surprise that we've seen decreasing levels of extreme cold days. And when we look at extreme heat, over the long term, that's been stable. However, for those who attended last week's webinar, if you recall, we've seen some very interesting results in the past decade. So this is something that we're definitely continuing to watch. So as I mentioned, we've seen our most significant temperature increases in winter. Since the 1930s, our winter temperatures have increased by about 2.5 degrees Celsius at Pearson Airport. Now, data from Orangeville shows a very similar trend, so this is a watershed-wide trend. When we look at our precipitation data, we also see some very clear trends emerging as well. The total annual precipitation we get throughout the watershed has been increasing as well. Not surprisingly, considering our warming winters, we're seeing more of our winter precipitation fall as rain, and we're seeing less snow. Our rainfall intensity and freezing rain days have been relatively stable in the long term. However, these types of events are often isolated and very localized, and they can be very challenging to measure. In order to accurately assess these, you really need a dense monitoring network, and that is something that just honestly hasn't existed historically. So we're hoping with our new enhanced network that we'll be able to detect these trends if they do change in the future. So we've already seen some very clear climate trends in our watershed, and most projections predict that those trends are going to continue to increase. If we look at the region of Peel projections into the 2050s, it's supposed to continue to get warmer. We're expecting more extreme heat in the summer, and our growing season length is going to continue to increase. With regards to precipitation, we're expecting to continue to see more and more precipitation, and we're also predicting to see more intense rain events and more extreme weather in general. Now, one interesting note here is that although we're expecting to see more rain, as more of it falls in these intense localized events, we may also see more prolonged periods of drought in between. So we have some very clear trends which are projected to continue to increase, and this will undoubtedly have impacts on both our environmental and human health. So I'd like to turn things back over to Josh now.
That was awesome, Tim, thanks. So now that we have an understanding of what type of trends we are seeing in the watershed, let's take a look at some of the impacts that our local environment is having. So to speak to this, I'd like to introduce Kelsey McNeil, who works with our ecological monitoring group. So Kelsey, what kind of impacts are you seeing for our plant and wildlife communities in the region?
Thanks, Josh, and good morning. So when we're looking at diseases that affect plants, similar to humans, temperature and moisture are the most important factors that affect these epidemics. In Ontario, the majority of plant diseases are not active in the late fall, winter, and early spring because of low temperatures. Different diseases favor different conditions, however. Some diseases do better in cold temperatures, while others are favored by hot conditions. Similarly, moisture is necessary for infection, reproduction, and spread in many plant pathogens, while some diseases flourish in drier conditions. Also similar to human disease, insects are an important vector of many plant diseases. When it comes to insects, temperature tends to be the most critical climatic factor. Very cold winters can increase insect mortality. However, when winters are warmer, many of these insects may survive. Warming winters can also expand insect population ranges, allowing them to survive in places they couldn't otherwise. High temperatures in the spring and summer could result in insects growing and developing faster, leading to more rapid increases in these pest populations. This is particularly important in spring, where current temperatures are a limiting factor for insect development and distribution. So when we're trying to predict plant disease response to climate change, it is important to understand the environmental requirements of each of these diseases, as these requirements can vary widely. So in this slide, it provides some examples of how climate change could affect tree diseases for some of our common trees in the watershed. So we have here listed some of our common tree species and associated diseases with them. The anticipated effect from climate change on that disease, and then the reason for these effects. For example, beech bark disease, which I'll speak to later in the next slide, is anticipated to increase in importance because the insect vectors will survive better over the winter with the warming temperatures, and the fungus on the trees has a longer growing season with increasing temperatures in the fall and spring. However, not all diseases are expected to get worse. For example, white pine blister rust on our pine trees is expected to decrease because of the warmer, drier growing seasons, which will actually slow the speed at which this disease spreads. One of the biggest threats to forest health in the Credit River watershed is beech bark disease. Beech trees are co-dominant trees in our hardwood forests. They provide important nesting habitat and nut production for many bird and mammal species. Beech bark disease results when the beech bark is attacked and altered by a beech scale insect, and then those areas of attack are then invaded and killed by a fungus. So beech bark disease spreads across the landscape in a predictable way with three distinct phases. Data from our forest monitoring as part of the Integrated Watershed Monitoring Program shows how beech bark disease have moved through the forest in our watershed. In 2009, just under a quarter of the monitored beech trees had no beech bark disease, which you can see here in the green, while 3/4 of the trees were colonized by a beech scale. This indicates that the disease was in the first phase, or the advancing front. By 2017, the disease has progressed to the second stage, or the killing front. You can see that by 2017, now then fewer than 10% of our monitored trees had signs of beech bark disease, and nearly 50% had already been infected by the scale, or the fungus, sorry. Beech trees begin to die 3 to 6 years following infection, triggering the third phase, or the aftermath forest. Therefore, we expect extensive beech tree death in the early 2020s across the watershed. Climate change may exacerbate this with rising temperatures, as I mentioned, that will allow the beech scale insect to survive over the winter, and longer growing season for the fungus to grow on the trees. Now we'll switch gears and we'll take a look at how climate change could affect disease in our wildlife populations, like reptiles and amphibians. So many diseases that impact reptiles and amphibians may exist in the environment at low levels without causing significant mortalities. However, when this is combined with other stressors, reptiles and amphibians are more susceptible to illness. That is when mass die-offs are more likely to occur. Stress brought on from climate change could include such things as drying of breeding ponds earlier due to hot, dry weather. And an example of this can actually be seen in our own watershed, where we have seen mass mortality events in frogs from Ranavirus, which is a virus that affects amphibians, reptiles, and fish. Mass die-offs of at least over 50 frogs were observed in the fall of 2019, and again just a week ago in the vicinity of the Credit River and Highway 24. If you're in the area, please send any observations of dead or sick frogs, fish, or turtles to CDC at the email below. One of the concerns with this virus is the potential spread of the virus to other areas. So if you spend time in the area, especially if you're fishing, we encourage you to consider decontaminating your waders, boots, and other gear. Air drying doesn't kill this virus, so decontamination through dilute bleach solutions is effective. There are other emerging reptile and amphibian diseases that are also not yet known to our watershed, but if they arrive, their effects could be exacerbated by climate change, like diseases such as snake fungal disease and amphibian chytrid fungus. So with that, I'll send it back to Josh.
Thanks, Kelsey. So I think as we can see, there's certainly a connection between the impacts associated with climate change and the spread of vector-borne disease in the natural environment. But before we go any further, I'd just like to take a quick second to remind everyone to keep posting questions in the Q&A chat, because we'll be getting to them very soon. So now that we have an understanding of the implications for the natural environment, I think it's a good time to now maybe flip our focus and take a look at the human aspect of this topic. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over now to Helen Doyle, our specialist from the Ontario Public Health Association. Helen, could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and give us an idea on whether or not we are seeing similar patterns of disease in human populations?
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. And good morning, everyone. My apologies for that delay. I'm really happy to join you today, and I represent the Ontario Public Health Association, as Josh had mentioned. But I'd also like to send regrets from the Public Health Department at Peel Region. They would have really liked to have joined us today and to give this presentation, but due to the focus being, for public health focus being on COVID, they had to decline. So I'm on the second slide, and I'm hoping everyone else can see that. The Ontario Public Health Association is a non-government organization providing leadership on issues affecting the public's health and strengthening the impact of those working in public and community health across Ontario. I chair our environmental health work group. I'm a volunteer. I retired from York Region Public Health 2 years ago and now volunteer in environmental public health. And our priority areas in environmental health are climate change, air quality, water quality, ecosystem health. And some of the examples I provided here are just, some of the examples are EcoHealth Ontario and our Make It Better campaign. EcoHealth Ontario is a collaborative of many agencies, and Credit Valley Conservation is also a member, and OPHA co-chairs that. And we work to increase awareness about the health benefits of green space, and we've done many different research reports on the air quality health benefits, climate change and health benefits of green space, as well as mental health and physical activity benefits. And the Make It Better campaign is OPHA's health-focused climate communication campaign, and we're trying to increase awareness of the need for climate action by speaking to parents and caregivers about the potential impacts of climate change to children, including Lyme disease, extreme heat, and asthma. So on this slide, I just wanted to, before I started to talk about climate-related infectious diseases, I wanted to briefly describe how public health agencies and other health researchers approach this assessment and the evidence, data, and tools that we use. So on the top right-hand side of the screen here, we start by examining the climate hazards or climate conditions and drivers that will endanger health. So the what? It could be extreme weather event, extreme temperature. We look at the established literature that provides that evidence on how a climate hazard might be linked to health. In the bottom right-hand corner, the where. So we take a closer look. If we're doing a local climate and health vulnerability assessment, we want to look at where the climate hazards will be the greatest. So the local climate data, some of the information that Tim and Kelsey just presented. We also use information that is provided through Public Health Ontario, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and other government organizations. One example is Lyme disease risk area maps that I will talk about in a couple of minutes. We then look at when this may happen. Again, we would use evidence that has been collected by various agencies, including Credit Valley Conservation, about the current climate conditions happening now and the trends. And finally, we look at who will be affected. So we try to identify the populations most impacted in our community. We use the literature, the established literature, which populations are at higher risk from, say, Lyme disease or heat-related illness. And then we look at local data within our communities. What are the demographics of our community? Do we have an aging population? Do we have a rural population where many people may be on private wells, so might be at risk of waterborne diseases if their well is flooded and they don't have protective measures in place? Or Lyme disease, are we in an endemic area and do we have a lot of outdoor workers or people that are active outdoors? So that's just an example of how public health agencies go about assessing impacts. And these are just some of the tools we use. Canada's Changing Climate Report has lots of data about the changing climate across the country, the health evidence we use as well. And on the right-hand side there is a health vulnerability and climate assessment guideline that the Ministry of Health developed for health units in 2015. So many health units are using that tool right now. So with respect to challenges, it maybe sounds simple when I talk about how we go about doing it, but it's not quite that simple. While we have better data on climate projections and the health risk, it's often challenging to quantify or assess the potential climate-related health impacts or the disease trends for a number of reasons. So first of all, attributing a health outcome to a climate driver is complex. If I could use the example of the Walkerton E. coli outbreak, well, many factors led to this tragedy. Climate was certainly a contributing factor. So there was drought followed by heavy rainfall. So of course, we've always had flooding, and without public health measures, we can continue to have more waterborne diseases. But with climate change, we can expect to have more extreme rainfall events. So we could expect to see, without health protective measures, we could expect to see more outbreaks of waterborne diseases. Number two, attributing a health outcome to a source. So we may know that someone has E. coli infection, so from a lab report, but we don't necessarily know, did that E. coli infection, so a pathogenic E. coli, I should say, did it come from a food source or a water source? So just like public health professionals are now doing contact tracing for COVID, we also do contact tracing for, we could kind of call it contact tracing, for things like E. coli. So we ask people, like, what had you eaten lately? Are you on a private well? Had you been traveling? So we're trying to find out the source, and it's very difficult to attribute a source directly to, or sorry, an outbreak or an infection directly to a source, unless it could be a large outbreak and you have actually samples of the food that people have eaten and you're able to make a positive correlation between the two. Thirdly, a challenge about monitoring for the disease vectors. Now, there's lots of this going on, but we can't do surveillance everywhere. So we have both active and passive surveillance. So example for mosquitoes and ticks. Active surveillance is when public health inspectors go out in the community. They could be dragging for ticks in the community to see if, in wooded areas, to see if there's the presence of the black-legged tick there. They could also be doing passive surveillance where they ask the public to bring in samples of, if they've been bitten by a tick, to bring in a sample of that tick. We also look at the climate drivers, so some of the information that was presented already and some of the other modeling that's done. So if we want to predict when beaches might be closed or when beaches might have high levels of E. coli, when they should be closed, we advise people not to swim in those beaches. We use what's called predictive beach modeling, and that relies on a lot of weather forecasting and climate forecasting as well. And the next bullet, reporting about climate-related diseases or health outcomes. So reporting isn't, so climate-related diseases or any infectious diseases, that there could be a lot of underreporting. So there's some evidence, I think one study that said only about 1 in 300 foodborne illnesses is actually reported to public health officials. So if we don't have that information, it's hard to track trends. And some of these climate-related diseases may not be specifically linked to that climate event. So if we think about heat-related illnesses, for example, in Quebec a couple of years ago, they had reported a number of heat-related deaths, but we didn't have that data in Ontario to be able to report that. And one of the reasons is we don't have the same syndromic surveillance procedures in place in Ontario as they do in Quebec. And what I mean by syndromic surveillance is when someone reports with a particular health outcome, let's say they came to the hospital and it was a heart attack or a heart condition, if at the same time there's an extreme heat event happening, that would be recorded as well in Quebec, so that you would be able to connect that to a particular climatic condition. And that's what's called syndromic surveillance. And that helps a lot in determining or trying to identify trends in all climate-related impacts, including infectious diseases. The next bullet about diagnosing emerging diseases. We're getting better at understanding testing for things like Lyme disease. There's still false positives for Lyme disease testing, but for emerging diseases, we may not have that testing available, so we are relying on that. And the last bullet here is about assessing the adaptive capacity. So in order to assess the risks, we have to know how adaptive are our populations and is our community. Do we have a lot of green space, for example, or do people have access to air conditioning for cooling? Is there a lot of awareness about this vector-borne diseases like West Nile virus or Lyme disease? Because that is going to reduce the health risk if we have awareness. And are there health protective measures in place? For example, reducing standing water for vector-borne diseases. And what is our population like? Is our population able to adapt? Are they more sensitive to some of these diseases? So maybe I'll just speak to climate trends in Peel. And I looked at the health status report for the region of Peel from 2019, and you can find that on their website. And so Peel is similar to Ontario. So we're expecting to see some of the similar things in Peel as we would in Ontario. So modeling done by Peel Region and public health partners at the province and at the federal level indicate that the climate trends that Peel is currently experiencing will continue, and they'll continue to have an effect on human health by increasing temperature-related illnesses and deaths, warmer temperatures impacting air quality and worsening lung and heart health, extreme weather events and flooding that would contribute to the risk of injury and death. Also, those extreme weather events and flooding and warmer temperatures increasing the potential for food and water contamination and thus foodborne illness. The expanding range for vectors of disease, such as Lyme disease and other vector-borne diseases. And certainly stress-related illnesses and mental health. We expect we could see more of these as people are dealing with the aftermath of extreme weather events, the health impact, and even the eco-anxiety about the concern for the future and what that might mean. And lastly, displacement of populations, whether it's displacement of populations within our own community or within other communities. So, for example, forest fires in the north, populations might have to be moved to other communities. So we have to prepare our communities if we need to welcome populations from other areas because of forest fires or flooding. So climate-related infectious diseases, the Canadian context, there's a range of infectious diseases that are influenced to varying degrees by climatic and environmental changes. So vector-borne diseases is one. I mentioned already respiratory infections such as hantavirus, and hantavirus is a respiratory infection that could be that could come from breathing in excrement from rodent droppings. And there was a study that was done, I think it was in the year 2000, an outbreak of hantavirus respiratory disease was linked to a local increase in the rodent population, which in turn was attributed to a 2 to 3-fold increase in rainfall before that outbreak. So we might see more of those respiratory infections. As I mentioned, waterborne illness, we could expect to see more waterborne illness. Here's a couple of examples: E. coli infection, giardiasis, cryptosporidiosis, and foodborne illnesses. The top foodborne illnesses across, or the top 3 across Canada, are Campylobacter, E. coli, and Salmonellosis. Something like paralytic shellfish poisoning, because we have warming waters on the Pacific. If we're purchasing shellfish, there's a more likely increase in toxins in shellfish because of the warming waters as well. So I'll just touch very briefly on food and water. So currently, 4 million Canadians are affected by foodborne illness annually, and we could certainly see that number go up if we don't take precautions to protect our food sources from climate change. So the Federal Public Health Agency of Canada has identified foodborne disease as a major concern in Canada and a significant climate change related threat. And the climate change variables that most influence food and waterborne diseases are increased temperatures, warmer water temperatures, extreme or heavy rainfall events. So we may expect to see this unless we put precautions in place. So moving on to mosquito-borne diseases. This is a visual created by the Canadian Communicable Disease Report, Public Health Agency of Canada. And I thought it provided a good explanation of how climate change increases the risk of mosquito-borne diseases such as West Nile virus that are endemic to Canada. So on the left-hand side, you see how increasing temperatures and changing patterns of precipitation cause the range and density of mosquito populations to increase, as well as the range and density of the host species that would be likely to transmit. So in the middle column, this shows how these climate changes on the left are increasing the risk of a number of mosquito-borne diseases such as West Nile virus. And on the right, the risk of acquiring those vector-borne diseases can be effectively managed through a number of public health measures and personal protective means. So for example, increasing awareness. So West Nile virus has been in Canada for a couple of decades now. So public health agencies are increasing awareness about where you might find West Nile virus. They provide information about how to prevent exposure, but like using DEET on your skin and on your clothes to protect yourself from mosquito bites, and covering up your skin, like wearing long sleeves when you're going out, and maybe the time of day you go out as well. It's also important that we are able to diagnose so that healthcare professionals have the information, especially when it's a new emerging disease, on how to diagnose and look for symptoms of these diseases. And providing care is certainly very important, and diagnosing it early. And it's so important that we monitor the risks and the climate drivers. So some of the active and passive surveillance and the syndromic surveillance I mentioned earlier. So in Peel region and beyond, the rates of West Nile virus are low in Peel. So between 2012 and 2016, there were 31 confirmed cases of West Nile virus. And in 2018, 5 confirmed cases and 1 probable case. Across Canada, there were over 6,000 human cases of West Nile virus reported since 2002. So I'll move on to tick-borne diseases. So similarly to the other graphic from Public Health Agency of Canada, this slide is showing how as temperature increases in the left, as temperature increases in Canada, the environment's going to become more suitable for ticks, and the season for tick activity will lengthen as we have milder seasons. So those tick-borne diseases are likely to become more common. And then the risk in the middle column, the risk of getting those diseases will increase. So we are already seeing increases in Lyme disease and the areas where Lyme disease is found. And there's other tick-borne diseases that are listed on this slide that we expect we're going to be starting to see as well. On the right-hand column talks about some of the ways to manage tick-borne diseases. There's lots of, if you go to any health unit website or Public Health Ontario or the Public Health Agency of Canada, there's lots of information about awareness about tick-borne diseases, how to prevent exposure, using DEET as well. And I'm going to get into a couple of bits of information about that diagnosis as well. And again, that fairly new disease to many parts of Ontario, so it's important that healthcare professionals have information about how to diagnose it, because early detection is so important in clinical care. I thought this was an interesting slide to show. This is from Public Health Agency of Canada. It's interesting because it shows the size of a tick. So the bottom right-hand corner, you see an adult tick. But as that tick feeds, so this would be a tick that would have been attached to a human or a mammal. And as it feeds, you can see the size of it grow. So as it's getting a blood meal, and that could happen 24 to 48 hours, that they could get to that size. So that's why it's so important that people check for ticks if they're in wooded areas. So they're found in wooded areas. They attach themselves to humans and animals and feed on their blood, and that shows you that range and size. So with respect to the occurrence or trends in Peel and beyond, there were 42 cases of Lyme disease reported between 2007 and 2016 in Peel region. In 2018, 10 confirmed human cases, 8 of those of which were acquired outside of Peel region, and there were also 2 probable cases. In Ontario, Lyme disease cases increased twofold to over 1,100 cases in 2019 compared to the 5-year average of 566 reported cases between 2014 and 2018. And Public Health Agency of Canada and Public Health Ontario, they use that 5-year average to smooth off trends so they can get a better sense of how the trend is playing out. In Canada, there were 7,516 human cases reported between 2009 and 2018. And that was an increase of Lyme disease cases in Canada from 144 in 2009 to 1,487 in 2018. And they haven't yet reported all the cases in Canada for 2019. So that statistic isn't available yet. So the vulnerable populations to tick-borne diseases, it's a number of factors, but the 2 I'll speak to here are sensitivity and exposure. So sensitivity would be describing individual factors of the population. So young children between the ages of 5 years of age and older adults, 55 and older, are more sensitive to tick-borne diseases. So if they're bitten by, or I would say to severe symptoms of tick-borne diseases. Those that are at increased risk of exposure to tick-borne or to the black-legged tick would be those that are engaged in outdoor activities in or near endemic areas where there are black-legged ticks. So for example, if they're hunting, fishing, hiking, camping, gardening, mushroom or berry picking, forestry, farming, any activities you might be doing in or near endemic areas, or if you are residing in or near endemic areas. And speaking of those endemic areas, I wanted to show you a couple of these maps. So these are maps that Public Health of Ontario produces to look at what the estimated risk areas are for Lyme disease. And this is where they may be finding the black-legged tick. And they collect this information from the tick dragging that is being done and the surveillance that's being done by health units across Ontario. So you can see from this map in 2018, a very small area of Peel region was showing in the map as an estimated risk area for black-legged tick. But as it shows on this slide, they could be, anywhere in Ontario you could get it, because however it's being carried, there's a possibility of getting it, but they just are identifying these as the risk areas. And in this map, this was just posted on Public Health Ontario's website. If you want more information on it, you can go to their website and type in Lyme disease. And you'll see Peel region here, it has spread, the risk area has spread quite substantially through Peel region, according to this map from 2020. And I thought this next one was kind of an interesting map. So Dr. Ogden from the Public Health Agency of Canada, so this is from 2008, where they predicted, Public Health Agency of Canada Dr. Ogden and his colleagues predicted the spread of Lyme disease by looking at where the tick population, and this is all related to climate conditions, how they see the warming climate increasing the spread of the vectors, the black-legged tick that is responsible for Lyme disease. So you can see by 2020, 2050, and 2080, certainly a vast spread and vast portion of the populated area of Ontario will be considered endemic for Lyme disease risk factors. And just touch briefly on personal protective measures. Again, there's much more information you can see at Public Health Ontario. To avoid tick bites, recommendations are to walk on cleared paths or walkways, to use insect repellent on your skin and clothing, to wear light colored clothing so that if when you come in, you could spot the tick because they are dark. And that when you are outdoors and you're in these areas, you tuck your shirt into your pants and pull your socks over your pants so they don't have access to the skin. And you check when you come in, and you check all over your body for any area that might have been exposed. And if you do find one, remove it as soon as possible. And there's instructions on how to remove ticks safely. And finally, removing tick habitats around your home, such as leaf litter. There's some studies that suggest that you could reduce the incidence, or I guess the populations or abundance of the risk factors for ticks, for black-footed ticks, by removing leaf litter, so up to 70% decrease. So that's quite substantial. So some really good advice on those websites on how to protect yourself. And that's it. This is the link to OPHA if you want to check out some of the other resources we have. And if you want to contact me, I'm quite happy to, if I can't answer your question, to pass it on to some of the experts. Thanks very much. Back to you, Josh.
All right, thank you, Helen. That was an interesting perspective. So continuing with the theme of Lyme disease, we're going to now stop and take a look at our second survey question. So are you worried about getting Lyme disease is what we asked. And as we can see, everyone is seemingly concerned, at least to some sort of degree. And it's a good thing because this is going to become more of a prevalent thing, and it's good that people are at least aware of it right now. So this kind of leads us into the next section. Helen was talking about some of the personal actions that we can take to protect ourselves from Lyme disease. So we asked the same question of our registrants to see how tick savvy you guys all were. So as you can see here, it seems like everyone has at least an idea of one of these activities that you can take. Again, another one here that Helen kind of touched on was to avoid woody areas, but another area to avoid is areas of tall grass, because this is like prime breeding spots for ticks and they love living there. So if you're going to go into a tall grass area, more than likely you're going to pick up something coming out. So now we know basically that we're doing kind of the right things. We've now had a refresher from Helen of the things we should be doing. We've got ourselves under control, but there's other people that or other organisms that we're concerned about, and in particular, this is dogs. A lot of people in the watershed have dogs, and so we need to keep in mind some of the things we can do to protect our animals when we go out into the wildlife or into the wilderness. So it's important to keep your animal on a leash. This is something we should be doing anyways, but even more so when we're dealing with ticks. You also want to, like Helen said, make sure that your dog stays on the same main trail and path that you are on. Don't let it wander off into the bush or tall grass. It'll likely pick up some ticks with it. And then the last thing you can do is you can make sure that when you return with your dog that you clean your dog off of all the ticks so that you ensure you're not bringing them back into the home with you to put other people at risk. And you can also make sure that you keep your animal up to date with its tick medication. So now we've covered what you can do to protect yourself and your pets, but now let's take a look at what you can do to protect your property, your community, and the environment as a whole. So one of the first things we've looked at is forest management. So forest management basically gives you an understanding of your forest. So what kind of species are in there, how old they are. It essentially gives you a stock of everything you have. It also ensures that you have healthy trees and that they're not stressed. If stressed, they can become susceptible to disease and things like pest infestations. So part of the management plan also includes monitoring, which helps keep your trees healthy, and it also allows you to keep tabs on basically invasive species or any pests that move in when you weren't looking. Another important aspect to look at is planting native. After all, they're designed for our land, and when you're doing any gardening or landscaping projects, it's always important that you ensure to use native plant species. They're better adapted, they provide food and habitat for wildlife far better than any non-native plants, and they're also designed to attract pollinators. And these are keeping our food on our table, and they basically are essential workers that we cannot live without. This also ensures that you're not adding to the problem of invasive species. Once established, these invasive species are very difficult and costly to remove. Lastly, another important thing that Helen even touched on a bit was standing water. If you have bird baths or areas where water can accumulate over extreme precipitation events, it's always good to regularly remove these or fill them in. Mosquitoes use these areas as breeding grounds, and they will increase your risk of mosquito-borne diseases. And with the trend of increasing precipitation, this activity is going to be even more essential moving forward. So at the end of the day, the whole idea we're trying to impart on you is supporting our ecosystems will help build their resiliency. And this is important when you're doing disease control. By enhancing ecosystem function through restorative activities, we can help reduce extremes. This requires us to be vigilant and to regularly monitor any changes that we see in our properties. But at the end of the day, the cliche term is knowledge is power. So how do you equip yourself with the knowledge that you need? Well, you can go on the internet and do a Google search like we always do for almost everything. But if you want information that is based locally and scientific data that pertains to your actual municipality, it's been analyzed, curated for your particular community, there is an alternative solution. And this is to ask your local conservation authority. You have a local conservation authority that your municipality has invested in, which has scientists, engineers, and ecologists that are available for you to give knowledge and advice. We also have a wealth of information and scientific data. And today we'd like to share with you some of the tools and information we have to help you make the most of your property. So we offer self-education through our Your Guide to Caring for the Credit information book, which basically tells you all the possible natural features you could possibly have on your land. They're not necessarily going to all be there, but you might have some of those. And what you can do with that is then create an action plan, which is basically a to-do list of all the activities you can do on your property. Beyond this, we also have specialized workshops, and we have print and web resources that we can refer you to as well. We also offer recommendations by conducting property site visits, and we can also hook you up with service provider lists for external services from CVC. We have internal funding as well through tree planting subsidies, as well as our Landowner Action Fund, which can reimburse you for 30 to 100% of your project costs, depending on the environmental merit of the project. We can also connect you with outside funding opportunities that exist, so stuff like municipality and provincial funding programs that are out there, so like rural water quality programs and maybe well abandonment programs. And we also have a wide range of services that we cover ourselves, so tree planting, plantation management, forest management, meadow restoration, aquatic and wetland restoration, advice on invasive species control, habitat structures, and we even have direct sale of nursery stock as well. So if any of this interests you, please feel free to contact us at stewardship@cvc.ca and let us help connect you with your property. We're also encouraging you to join us for our last installation of our 3-part webinar series for rural residents on climate change and health associated with severe weather on June 11th at 7 p.m. Well, it brings us to the end of our presentation, but before we get to the question and answer period, I'd just like to take the opportunity to get our participants to fill out our evaluation form. Allison's going to be posting that link in the chat right now. And it basically gives us an idea of how well we did and any topics for future webinars that you may be interested in. So right now I'm going to hand it over to Allison to deal with some of the questions, and we'll get some of those expert answers for you right now.
Great, thank you, Josh. So we do have one question, which I think is a great question. Someone has asked that the CBC webinar on pollinators said not to remove leaves. So how do you win good bugs versus bad? And I might take a shot at actually answering this question because this is something that I've thought about myself. With regards, I think, to larger properties, certainly we've talked about the issue of how wildlife around the home can cause challenges. And so we've always encouraged people to create great habitats a little bit further away from your house. So I think supporting and encouraging those habitats, those natural habitats, if you have a larger property, and then if you've got a smaller property like myself, I just moved into a new home. It's got a smaller yard, and my plan would be to have certain areas on my property that I'm going to keep more naturalized, and then other areas where I know that potentially my kids are going to be accessing or more engaged in. I would try and keep those areas a little bit clearer of brush and leaves, and I would be telling my kids, I think, to, if they are in those areas that are going to be more woody and grassy, that we're going to have to be aware of ticks, and going in, doing those tick checks, doing some of those things like wearing longer sleeve clothing potentially when we're in those areas. So I think it's a combination, but I think you can still have more naturalized areas on your property and promoting that habitat and those benefits for our good insects, while still trying to manage that risk. So that would be my approach. I don't know if anybody else wants to also weigh in on that.
Hi, this is Helen. Thanks, Allison. That's an excellent suggestion, and I think it does start with awareness. Like we have to live in harmony with nature, and we've done that for forever. And when we have maybe new emerging diseases, we just have to have a better awareness of where those the vectors for those diseases might be and how we can minimize the risk. So we also often get asked the question, we try and promote people getting out in nature for their physical and mental health, but we get asked the question, well, what about our risk of getting West Nile virus or tick-borne diseases, Lyme disease? So, and we say it's all about awareness to make sure that you understand your personal protective measures that can be put in place, things that you can do that was mentioned a couple of times already, reducing standing water, but certainly we've done this, we do this all the time, just maybe naturally for so many other things. We now know, you wear a hat when you go out, you wouldn't go out in the sun because of exposure to the sun. So we just got to make sure that we're aware of these other risk factors that could be contributing to a multitude of different either infectious diseases or other health impacts.
Helen, with regards to the predictive modeling, is that something that we can do sort of on a seasonal basis and look at certain variables? And then, how would public health units be responding to that? Can they say that, this season is going to be bad for ticks?
Mm-hmm. So the predictive modeling that I was referring to in that particular case was for beech modeling. So health units do, and this traditionally, we would go out and take water samples from the beach and then would wait a couple of days until we got the results back. And then we'd let the public know what the water quality was 2 days ago, because that was when we took the water samples. So now with predictive modeling for beaches, it relies on sample results, but it also relies on years of data. So certainly we've known this before, but it's really good to have the models where you can predict where this may be happening. We have our monitoring that shows what the water levels of E. coli have been in our public beaches for maybe the last 10 years. And when we see the changes like higher E. coli events in the water, it's very likely after there was a heavy rainfall event. So predictive modeling means that we might preemptively give advice about not going to the beach after a heavy rainfall because we have those models. So I imagine it might not be called, probably is called predictive modeling, but by the same tools that are used in water, looking at water quality and beach monitoring would be done for the modeling for tick-borne diseases. So for example, the risk map that I showed for Lyme disease that was just released last week from Public Health Ontario, they come up with those maps based on past years of tick activity. So a lot of data, monitored data goes into that. in order to come up with a model. But I would say that your best bet would be to contact the local health department to ask what methods they are using to do that and whether or not that would be applicable for some of the areas that the Conservation Authority would be monitoring as well.
Thank you, Helen. So we have another question with regards to whether or not there's a way to treat wild deer to control ticks, or are they not the main carrier? So Helen, do you know the answer to this question, whether or not it's mainly deer that are the vector, or are there other species that would be involved in carrying ticks?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that question about testing in wild deer, like looking at the populations. But it is like the ticks, the hosts are mice and deer. So if we can expect to see expanding deer and mice populations as we get changes in temperatures. But I'm not aware. That could be something that we could ask Public Health Ontario, and I'd be happy to see if I can get an answer for you to see how they're doing that, if they're monitoring that, or if there is any treatment.
So I did have a question as well with regards to climate and emerald ash borer. Kelsey, do you know whether or not climate played a role in the advancement of EAB, emerald ash borer?
So what I understand for emerald ash borer, the overwintering kind of survivability ranges somewhere in the minus 35 degrees. So I think at this point, climate change hasn't played a big role in its advancement thus far, but I know they're concerned about in more northerly climates where they currently do have those really cold winters, but if they continue to warm, then emerald ash borer may be able to move more northerly than it would be able to right now.
So that would be something that's a factor as we look at that species moving further north.
Yeah, areas up near like Winnipeg, that sort of direction.
So it looks like we are at 11 now, and I don't see any other questions currently. So I think I'll hand it back over to Josh just for our wrap up.
Thanks, Allison. So ultimately, I'd just like to thank our presenters for coming out today. We've had Tim and Kelsey for the past webinar, and this is Helen's first, so it was really great to have you guys here. There's a good perspective you all provided for us. And beyond that, I just want to let you guys know that you guys can again contact us at stewardship@cvc.ca if you have any questions or concerns or anything. Please bug us. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out, and hopefully we see you at our next webinar. Thank you.